Hello again, this is Nick Roach, and again we're outside. We've been very lucky with the weather recently, when I've been doing the videos anyway. Today I'd like to say a few words about different teachings. Now for me, because I only followed one teaching, lived it entirely, every moment of every day as best I could, and in some ways I don't follow the teaching now, it is my life. So that's 25 years or so, since I was 18. And to me, it became obvious. Surely everybody must be facing and dissolving their emotion and getting their life right in order to grow in self-knowledge. That was what I assumed. Everybody must be doing it, because it's the only way that I knew. And then eventually when it happened here, and I began looking around, speaking with other people and reading other teachings, I found pretty much no one's doing it, except the people I knew from the existing teaching. Nobody was learning about how the emotions create the outside, and how to dissolve the two, and how to get one's life right. No one was doing that, as far as I can tell. And yet other people have been having successes doing other practices, other methods, completely unrelated, completely different. This was strange to me. But then I also looked around me and noticed that some people in the same teaching as I've been in all these years, some of those have been also living it as best they can. Actually, everybody lives everything as best they can, but for the sake of the point, they've been living it as best they can for all these years, some of them even longer than I have been doing it, and yet they would not claim, let's say, to be self-realized, God-realized, enlightened. So suddenly I begin to question the teaching, at least the idea that this is the way to do it, because if other people are doing it different ways, and some people doing it the same way as me haven't done it, what's going on? And I can't say it's a fluke it happened here, because I didn't just wake up one day and it happened. It was a steady process which I can explain and describe. It's a logical process, and it becomes matter of fact that there's no faith or belief in it. It's almost a scientific method. The emotion creates the physical world, dissolve the emotion, and the physical world becomes simpler and more in line with what one unconsciously wishes or will enjoy, and life becomes simpler, and the attachment to being separate dissolves. So, very simple. I then think back some years ago. I remember reading a teacher of non-duality. I think he said that there's nothing one can do. One may as well sit on the toilet reading a newspaper, drinking a cup of coffee and eating biscuits, for all the good any teaching would ever do them. And I imagine that's because for him he didn't follow a method or practice or teaching. So in his case that might be absolutely correct. It will just happen. It did just happen. And then I've got a good friend who is in the state, who found an online description of a mental practice on how to still the mind, and after a few hours, days, weeks of all day practicing this to see what would happen, it just felt right for him. He found he was in that state all the time. And the mind, of course, would say, right, that technique is amazing, that's the one, that worked in only a few weeks, he did it, amazing, took Nick 25 years. But then speaking with him, the memory comes up that some years earlier he had to face his own death. He was sure he was about to die, and there was nothing he could do about it. Within a couple of minutes he would be dead. And he describes the amazing peace and stillness, just total acceptance, that's it. And he recognises the state he's connected with and he's in now from that experience. So suddenly we can see, so it's not just that practice or technique that got him into the experience, that enabled him to connect with that experience from years ago, which had been introduced to his psyche, and he was therefore able to access it if only he had a tool to enable him to do that. And as it had been thrust upon him, it wasn't a soft, gentle introduction over many years. It was all hope had been ripped out of him, and there was no hope, and then there was peace. And then of course we have the Buddha, whose story describes him looking and studying and exploring many practices, many spiritual teachings, some of them extremely painful apparently, and some of them starving himself and doing whatever he could to find the end to emotional suffering. And the story describes that in the end, eventually, one day he sits down, feels the space within him where it's still, and he knows, I've got it, this is it. And therefore people in the Buddhist tradition often teach, then that's the way, sit down, still, feel the peace, and that's it. Because that's what the Buddha did. And yet he didn't only do that. He spent years studying, exploring and practicing, putting his body and his mind through all sorts of very strenuous and painful practices to try to find it. And to me, that was part of the journey, part of the process for him. That any little bit of sitting down there, if one believes that, one may as well believe that when the other teacher said you may as well sit on the toilet reading a newspaper, eating biscuits and drinking coffee, that if that actually become enlightened while you're doing that, if that actually works, that becomes a teaching. It worked for me, that's all I did. When common sense would say, well, that's not all you did. That isn't really what, because otherwise the moment any of us sat down and did that, read a paper, drank coffee on the toilet, it would happen, and it doesn't. In the same way with the Buddhism. Just because at the end he sat down and felt that space and that was it, doesn't mean the first time somebody else sits down and feels the space they'll be enlightened. It was the end of the process for the Buddha. Again, that's not to say it's not valuable and helpful. The point is, just because something works for one person at a particular point, that does not mean that particular practice will work for everybody in the same way. Some people, as we've said, don't follow a practice or a method at all, and they still get there. So I wanted to really just say a few words to show light on this idea that yes, there are different teachings and different practices and different methods, and I can understand each teacher where it's worked for them saying this is the way, you have to do this, it worked for me so it'll work for you. But I don't know. I'm not that fixed. A teaching will work where it works. It will help where it helps. And while I would say, because I have to, it's my life, that my teaching describes a process that is understandable, and one at least can understand what's happening in one's life, why things happen, and I could even say looking at it in that way is possibly the most direct route without it happening like a bolt of lightning. Where it just happens to one, bang, of course that's the quickest way. But if one's waiting for it to happen, one might have to wait a lifetime. Of course, if one's not even looking for it and it happens, fantastic. And if one just tries a technique and it works immediately, amazing. But if one's starting off now and one is unhappy, let's say, and wants to make their life simpler and better and for them to be more in control of the circumstances of their life, I can certainly teach you how to do that. And yet, this is of course your life. This is not my life. I'm talking to you. This is your life. So your life will not be the same as mine. The path or experiences very likely will not be the same as mine. And if one tries to replicate the path someone else has done, that's when one can start to experience conflict. I'm not doing it right because I haven't had that. That didn't happen to me. What's going on? I'm failing here. When you can't fail. There's only one life here, one being, and you are it. Who else can it be if there's only one? So this is your life and you're living it in the correct and only way that you can. Oh, you can change it tomorrow or today in 10 minutes time. It can change, but as you live it in each moment, you're doing all you can. So there's no judgment. And there's no failure. You can only do your best. And just know, I suppose, that whatever you do, spiritually speaking, don't believe anyone, not even me, that tells you there's one method, one practice, and that's the one you have to do. Because there's an awful lot of people that have done other methods, other practices, or no methods and no practices, and have also got there. And yet, if you've got to do something, if you're already listening to this, then you probably feel moved to do something. Then being aware of being aware is probably a pretty good start. Whatever you're teaching you do, if they are teaching self-realization, God realization, non-duality, enlightenment, self-actualization, liberation, whatever one wants to call it, it's always going to be within oneself. It's not going to be over there. So wherever you are, you know it's going to be in yourself. So feeling in that space is not going to be in conflict with any other teaching. And feel there and stay there as much as you can. And then you're already halfway living my teaching. The other half is getting your life right and holding that space and the knowledge when there's a problem and dissolving it. But there's no judgment, and there's no failure, and there's no right or wrong. It's just life being lived exactly how it should be. Thank you.